Well, perhaps we can begin. It's by my watch, 5 o'clock, right on. My name is Paul Perron, and I'm director of the Center for the Study of France and the Francophone world at the Monk School. And it's, for me, a great pleasure and a great honor to present François Cusset, who is professor of American Studies at University of Paris Nanterre, teaches seminars in critical theory at Sciences Po in Paris, in various schools in Europe. He holds diplomas from l'École Normale Supérieure in Modern Literature, Université de Paris 4 at Sorbonne, the Paris Institute of Political Studies, as well as a doctorate in Sciences, Information and Communication. He has also collaborated with numerous research groups on cultures, notably the Humanities Institute of the University of California at Irvine and the University of Quebec at Montréal, UQAM, on the imaginary, yes, neoliberalism on both sides of the Atlantic. Professor Cusset's numerous theoretical publications in French, translated into 11 different languages. Last time I went through his CV over the last 20 years, had and continues to have a profound impact on the social sciences and humanities, starting with French theory, how Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and co. transformed the intellectual life of the United States. And that was in 2003 when it was translated. Again, his second book that was really very major is The Inverted Gaze, queering the French literary classics in America. That was in 2011. And recently, in French, Hatred of Emancipation, Stand-Up Youth of the World in 2023, which will be translated. If I may, I'd like to evoke Professor Cusset's quest in his numerous publications, conferences over the last 30 years by quoting Philip K. Dick's narrator, Jason Taverner, in a dystopian science fiction novel. It's entitled, Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. So stop there, and the theory changes. The theory changes the reality it describes in 1974, which permeates much of Professor Cusset's work. He is, I thank Professor Cusset for his lecture today entitled, How the World Swung to the Far Right. He addresses and explores how we got there, which is both a historical question and a positional, political, I should say, an existential urgent. But before I give the floor to our distinguished speaker, I ask the audience to hold questions and discussion until the end of his presentation. Now, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for this flattering presentation. Can you all hear me? No microphone needed? No? Well, thank you to all of you for being here. So yes, basically, the title of this presentation is a slightly modified version of the title of this little book, How the World Swung to the Right, with the very simple idea that this book being published in English in 2018, 6 years later, we might have to add 3 short letters to the title. No longer the right, but the far right. So I apologize in advance for the very general nature of what I will be speaking about. It's so broad, in fact, that it's tricky to dare, saying things like the ones I'm going to say. But what I would like to share with you, and as an object for further discussion, is precisely the diagnosis made by this little book and what has changed about this diagnosis in those very short 6 years. All right. In fact, 6 years is short, but I was thinking in a silly way that 6 years is the number of years separating 1933 from 1939. You know, the election of then unknown Adolf Hitler and the beginning of World War II. So 6 years can indeed be long in terms of what's going on. I'll start maybe with a list, a very factual list of what has happened during these 6 years, which somehow force us to update maybe the diagnosis made in this book. Well, it has been the COVID pandemic, if I remember well, right? Which has opened a new type of conflict, we'll go back to it in a moment, between what one might call biopower, okay, in the terms of Michel Foucault, meaning a mix of public authorities eager to protect our health, pharmaceutical labs and firms eager to make money and help those authorities protect our health and everything. And in front of them, a rising group of people, citizens, you know, anonymous people who are more and more wary of both the power of science and of public authorities and ready to, in fact, put everything in question to the point of, you know, conspiracy theories as the ones they are spreading these days. So about our health, there's a new type of conflict. It seems like in 6 years, climate change has accelerated. And we're not discussing it in the same terms as we used to 6 years ago. In 6 years also, it seems that the global rise of the populist right, the far right, we'll see if we say far right or right, has consolidated, extended, okay, is now present in more governments than 6 years ago, for sure. And we'll see that if it's not in power, it represents the first political force in many of our countries. And I'm speaking about my own country here. There has been also in 6 years the return of, I was going to say, classical war or warfare. Classical as in territorial, okay, Russia invading Ukraine, and the climax of tension and war in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza are just the two most visible and most serious signs of a certain return of warfare, maybe a post-Cold War return of warfare, but it's been a while already. And I would say that all of these changes that I listed way too quickly emerge against the background of a new thing that we were not discussing so much 6 years ago, AI. And the fact that whether it's artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, you know, you name all these programs, they might be ready to take over where humans have failed. Maybe they have failed politically, ideologically. We'll see that. It means that in 3 years, the thread linking capitalism and democracy is even thinner, okay, has thinned down to almost nothing. It seems like the reasons to dread the near and midterm future are much higher and more intense than 6 years ago. So this is what I will cover now. Just 2 points before I actually start. 1 point of method and 1 point on the terms I am using in this book and in this presentation. The point of method, but I suppose it's useless. We all agree that to cover such general historical tendencies, we must presuppose that history is not made by individuals. Okay, there are famous, notorious individuals to whom we should not reduce the historical process. To make a long story short, Donald Trump is not the problem at all. The problem is the system, whether it's the US political system, whether it's a global ideological system that makes Trump possible. Okay, and you could say the same about any head of state or leader. Again, I'm not drawing any comparison, but in that exact same logic, initially, Adolf Hitler was just a political clown chosen by German industrialists, okay, to win their ideological battle against rising communist forces in interwar Germany. Okay, of course, their toy escaped their hands. And as for the, so what I mean here is that history is a matter of power balances, power forces, profound tendencies that we need to track down. And we'll have to pay attention to very different factors here. Then a point on the two concepts, the right and the left. Should we still be using these? I believe not. Okay, we all remember that they date back to the summer of 1789, when the French revolutionary forces, who had just taken the Bastille, okay, gathered for the first constitutional meeting, okay, and the defenders of the monarchy, okay, absolute or constitutional, however you name it, were asked to seat on the right, when defenders of the Republic, okay, Montagnard, Girondins, and all these various factions were asked to seat on the left. So you see, it could have been the other way around at this point. There are many reasons, we'll go back to it, why this very polarity is blurred these days. So I would much rather qualify right and left instead of using these two words. And I think we can still use the words progress for the left, meaning progressist forces. I'm not judging them as better. I'm just saying that they do believe in some sort of advancement of progress still accessible in terms of rights, living or labor conditions, okay, and at many levels. And as for the former right, what we used to call the right, use the word reaction or conservation, okay, conservatism, but reaction is probably better, in the sense that these conservative forces are now explicitly at war against the major advances conquered over the last decades by progressist forces. Which are they? Secularization, to a certain point, racial and gender equality, which is never, of course, fully attained, the rise of the global south, which have completely changed global coordinates, right? Creative culture, avant-garde or bold creative culture, and the very idea of regulating capitalism, okay? And maybe having public authorities set rules to contain climate change. Okay, these things being seen by many conservatives as the invisible hand of deep state, right? Big government. So I'll cover the subject in 5 quick points. The first one is a very quick chronological point, which is how did we get here? And that's basically a summary of this little book, the 3 decades leading us to where we are now. The second point will be a sort of summary of the pillars, the new foundations of this unqualified political force, which we don't know if we call the right or the far right, which is definitely ruling global politics these days. The third point will be an attempt at understanding that if this political force has won, it's not only because of what they did to win, okay, but more so because of what their adversaries, progressist forces, the left wing, social democrats, liberals, however you call them, have not done to stop them. The fourth point, and that's probably the key point here, will be a point about desire, how the far right or the right has won the key battle, which is the battle of the hearts, the battle of desirability, the battle of emotions, affects, okay, and as such are indeed a new revolutionary force. And that's what we'll do a point of conclusion with the eternal question of what can we do in such an ordeal? So quickly, the first point, and here again, it's a summary of what I say in the book. these are broad lines, historical lines. But I believe, and I hope you share this belief, that after World War II, the world has gone through at least 3 decades of objective progress, okay, of good news. And in human history, these good news are so rare that it's important to point to it. Okay, what were they? Well, first of all, the end of the World War, okay, the reconstruction of the world's economy, going with, prosperity and a certain containment of socioeconomic disparities. Then you have, of course, the youth protest movement, which has sort of dominated that period and gained important victories, okay, in terms of lifestyle, of culture, of democracy, of changing the general spirit of the time. Then we also had an economic system, capitalism, which was more directly regulated, okay, than it is today. Okay, it was a mixed economy. Your heavy neighbor, the US, was still under the legacy of the New Deal back in those years. Okay. And to finish on this 30-year-long emancipatory sequence, progressive sequence, good sequence, let's not forget that half of the planet went through the decolonization process, and that the 2 major colonial empires of modern times, France and Great Britain, were dismantled, okay, which cannot be seen as something else than a progress. So the reason why I'm insisting on these 3 decades is to understand that the 5 following decades, okay, the sort of counter-revolution that follows, okay, which goes from, say, the mid-late 1970s all the way until today, might be a direct reaction to the previous sequence, might be a way for powers in place, whether they be economic, ideological, religious, or political, to try and take back part of what was taken from their power, to try to erase, okay, or regress, okay, and at least a backlash. Okay, I think the most famous emblem, it's just one sign, but it's such a clear one, a sign of this backlash is, of course, the 2022 Supreme Court decision in the US, okay, which puts an end to the Roe v. Wade era, okay, opened in 1973, when the Supreme Court made abortion constitutional in the US. Okay, so it lasted exactly 50 years. The day after that fateful Supreme Court decision of 2022, I remember this great demonstration in Washington, DC, where women of all ages were demonstrating in front of the Supreme Court building with this great slogan, "Your guns have more rights than our vaginas." Might be a good summary, okay, if even a rough one of the kind of situation we're in today. So you see, there is indeed a mechanical process of backlash or reaction to the previous sequence. So this reaction unfolds in 3 steps, which more or less corresponds to the 3 decades, okay, of this historical U-turn, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. The 1980s is the decade of the takeover. Okay. It starts as an electoral surprise, okay, with usually the founding date of this era is, of course, the double election in 1980 of Margaret Thatcher, in fact, it's 1979, in Great Britain, and Ronald Reagan in the United States. And the subsequent wave of deregulation, privatization, financial turn and globalization of their national economies that's quickly undertaken by these 2 governments. But it's beyond who's in power and who's elected. It's also the time of an ideological takeover, where opinion leaders, those sharing the necessity of this turn towards a more radical form of capitalism, voice out this project everywhere in the media, everywhere in bookstores, on television, in talk shows, and their opinion, which was a minority opinion in the previous sequence, becomes a popular one, if not a dominant one. The following decade, 1990s, I would characterize it as a decade of doctrinal or ideological euphoria. Remember, fall of the Berlin Wall, dismantlement of the Soviet Union, end of the so-called communist alternative, quote unquote, because it had nothing communist about it except the name, of course. And on the side of defenders of liberal democracy and the market economy, okay, the US and its allies, it seemed like a historical triumph. Okay, let's remember the kind of thing that were said back then, okay, Francis Fukuyama publishing his famous report on the end of history, okay, on the advent of the last man, maybe the last woman as well. Basically, it's as if all ideological conflicts in history had ended. Consensus, we all agree. Of course, this euphoria does not last. In fact, in a matter of a few months, warfare is back, okay? War in the Gulf with the first Iraq war, civil war in Algeria, war in Yugoslavia, the first war in Europe in 40 years, and so on and so forth. It's also this second decade, 1990s, the decade of the implementation of all these principles laid out in the 1980s. It's concretely implemented in terms of the takeover of shareholders on corporate economy, the change of rules for financial markets, for national economies. It's basically everything that was abstract in the 1980s becomes implemented and concrete in the 1990s. But I believe the third moment, the third decade, is the most decisive, the 2000s, because it's the moment when this new force, this new ideology, I haven't named it yet, right or far right, at least a mix, and that's really the important point, a mix of a radical market economy or radicalized market economy and a conservative or traditionalist kind of right wing. Okay, these two families of the right wing of the markets and the right wing of traditional values, had never worked hand in hand. In fact, had always been competing with each other. And they strike a historical deal, an alliance, which is what has put them in power ever since. And this decade, the first decade of the 21st century, is the key decade of that alliance. Why? Because of breakthrough events, major events in that decade, which will make this new force a force of opportunism, a force adapting to every event, every breakthrough event, in order to consolidate its new power. What am I talking about? 9/11. Okay, the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, which, as you remember, were recoded into a change of era. Okay, well, easy. I mean, we had changed millennium the year before, right? And were used to impose this new agenda, this new paradigm, the clash of civilizations. Okay, and the fact of viewing the world no longer in terms of social movements, social classes, socio-economic conditions, which, as you know, can change, okay, evolve, and replacing them by issues of culture, race, geography, where are you from in the world, religion even, which cannot be so easily changed, okay, as a social position, is a key change of paradigm, okay, and has been imposed. Of course, this worldview, we all know it now, was wrong, and proved wrong, in fact, 10 years into the famous war on terror, started by George W. Bush, but it was too late, in a way, okay? This new agenda had been imposed. So the main moment where this neoliberal or right, far right political force can basically build its opportunism is the subprime crisis of 2008. Okay. And that's an easy point. The way the US and the larger world economy was rescued was through public money. Okay, in fact, the largest public or taxpayers fundraising in human history, okay, to help rescue giant banking, insurance, and industrial corporations, which were, of course, the #1 reason why this crisis had taken place. Okay, and here let's remember, I'll just open a quick bracket, with all due respect to the great man and intellectual that he is, that US President Barack Obama missed a historical opportunity to be the Roosevelt of the 21st century and clearly refused to do so. Okay, let's remember that during this basically nationalization or financial takeover of private bankruptcies by federal authorities, he refused to impose any rules on these very corporations he was helping, to the point that the year after, 2009, was the historical record-breaking year for bonuses given off to financial traders. In other words, they had put the world, okay, on its knees, and they were generously rewarded for it. Okay. So this is, it's way too quick, but you have those 3 decades or 3 movements, an ideological takeover, a legal and social implementation, and a change of paradigm, which forced this new political camp or force to adapt and consolidate it, okay, consolidate its power. Now, the result of these 3 decades of change, of radical change, is a political and social system very different from the one of the previous era, okay? A system standing on a few pillars that I want to list now. Again, way too broad, way too general, but maybe general can be generous. We'll try this. And it proves that whether hyperconservative forces are in power or not, they have permeated the public space, the space of opinions and ideologies, okay, the media, so much that these pillars I'm going to list now are the pillars of this new world, whether you have a Trump, an Orban, a Bolsonaro in power, or someone of a more liberal and progressist camp. First pillar, there is no alternative to the market economy, to the capitalist system. Okay, we all remember the TINA motto popularized by Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s when she reached power in Great Britain. The market remains, at the end of this 50-year-long turn, the last grand narrative still standing on its feet. Okay, all the other isms, okay, liberalism, neoliberalism, communism, socialism, okay, have undergone serious crisis if they still do exist. The absence of alternative, of viable alternative to the market economy system is the last ideological motto of our time. Even when those very people who orchestrate, okay, capitalism themselves no longer believe in their very principles, which is why they actually rely on the state and on public authorities much more than on the private market. Because we have to remember that financial markets have benefited during this entire 5-decade cycle of every major global tragedy. They have cashed in, okay? Remember at the end of the COVID lockdown, if you looked at financial values on the stock market, not only of web giants, who of course benefited from the fact that we were, hooked to our screens, from our homes, but of, major service and industrial values, okay? As if keeping us home by force, suspending our civil liberties, proved out to be good for the stock market. Same with the return of war, okay? We all know that war is good for business, right? And the return of warfare in the post-Cold War era has also stimulated the what used to be called the military-industrial complex. The environmental apocalypse or the environmental crisis, which is the #1 preoccupation in today's world, has also proved a great opportunity to cash in. Okay, it's called greenwashing or green capitalism, okay, or the new green rules, okay, to regulate industrial economies. Well, it makes corporations rich. So this absence of alternative to the market economy is the first pillar. The second pillar is the individual, but the individual in the sense of individualizing every single aspect of social and political life in order to basically erase collective structures, organizations, and principles of the previous era. It's as if the very dream of Ayn Rand had come true. Okay, it sounded like a crazy utopia with some sort of right-wing anarchists back in the 1950s. It seems like it's become true, right? Any issue, any problem has to be solved in terms of individual psychology, individual or intersubjective dialogue and treatment. Collective paradigms no longer work. The third pillar, much more obvious than the two first ones because it's more present in the streets, is law and order. From police forces repressing social movements in more brutal ways than they used to in previous decades, to private security and endless technologies of surveillance and control, okay, tracking us wherever we are and whatever we do. We live in a world, okay, where policing is the #1 economic activity, first of all. It makes corporations rich, and is something we must all take into account, right? By the way, the global prison population in this 5-decade-long sequence has tripled. And you all know that the world population has not. So we basically, for good or bad reasons, live under a police boot that often looks like a military boot. And we don't need to be living in Russia for that. Fourth pillar, and that's maybe closer to what we know of the far right today, traditional values presented and disseminated as, you know, a sort of surrogate utopia or replacement, okay, of collective hopes of yesteryear. Okay, now that we know that the world cannot change, should not change, okay, at all, we always have traditional values. So what are they? We will more or less know what they are. Family, religion, patriotism, hard labor, okay, more or less based on a meritocratic system. Okay. Obviously, the days of such mottos as sex, drugs, and rock and roll are over. And I would say that the fifth pillar, and that's quite important, that makes all of that mix possible. Okay. It's kind of the background music, like the elevator music, you know, that sort of sets everyone in motion, is the entertainment industry, is the quasi-obligation to amuse ourselves to death, okay, as the late Neil Postman had it, okay, when his famous essay from the, I think it was from the 1990s, amusing ourselves to death. Back then it was mostly cable television, obviously. The media outlets have, you know, renewed their offer. Okay, we have social media, we have all sorts of sources, but it's as if entertainment, postmodern culture, and almighty media industry, all of them were catching our attention, okay, which is, you know, what they sell, what they make money off, okay, and obviously diverting it away from things that might matter more, whether it's social injustice, economic disparities, or the environmental crisis. Again, if I list these 5 pillars, we can ask the question, okay, so what about in the 1960s? Were they so different? Yes, they were different. Yes, if we were to find exact equivalents of these pillars of the dominant socio-political order 50, 60 years ago, they would not be the same. Yeah. Welfare and regulation coming from the state was one pillar. It no longer is. The collective and the various collective organizations through which, okay, the world was coming to us, was reaching us, whether it's a labor union, a political party, or a sports team, okay, even, were also one such pillar. Protesting about everything, okay, but protesting usually on the progressist side of politics, okay, was another pillar, and so on and so forth. So you see, there is a shift of the power balance worldwide in this long 50-year long sequence. We go from the age of Gandhi and Lyndon B. Johnson to the age of Donald Trump and Narendra Modi, to stick to these 2 countries. We go from the age of Woodstock to the age of QAnon, if we really want to compare 2 sides of radical protest. We go from the age of the Cold War, okay, and its old class struggle prism, which was still dominant back then, to the clash of civilizations in which we're stuck, at least the expression, ever since 2001. And as iconic references for the youth, for example, okay, back 60 years ago, it would have been someone, you know, between Martin Luther King Jr. and Bob Dylan, if you really want to US citizens. Today, unfortunately, it's as if there was one single proper name familiar to the global youth, and I'm afraid it's Elon Musk. So, you know, I'm playing with this sort of structural comparison. And again, in this general shift, very broad shift, minority struggles, okay, struggles for gender equality, for racial equality, for environmental, you know, action, that are usually presented by conservative forces as, you know, the zeitgeist, the dominant opinion of the time, are minority struggles, okay? They actually are not the norm, okay? Wherever they take place, they face strong opposition. They might actually be erased, okay? Or a regression might follow. Never in the world are they dominant. I mean, except if you really spend your time in maybe a small portion of Brooklyn, New York, okay, or the 11th arrondissement of Paris, okay? But apart from a few gentrified and liberal neighborhoods, the rest of the world does not see these minority principles as their priority. So my third point, if you kind of follow the way I'm processing, is this idea that if we went through this U-turn, it's not only because reactionary forces, conservative forces, the actual active right wing has intended to do so or to take power. It's also because in front of them, liberal, social democratic, however you call them, governments who have actually exercised power during this 5-decade-long period are the number ones responsible for it. Okay. So let's start with the attack by reactionary forces, and then we'll move to the responsibility of liberals. Because yes, neoconservative forces, as they were called back in the 1980s. It was the first time when this word was used, okay, 1980s. They were mostly advisors to President Reagan, okay, ideologues, opinion makers, who understood that they needed to win the battle of ideas, as they said, okay, because that battle, liberals had a dominant position in that battle. Liberals were capitalizing on the legacy of the 1960s. Liberals were cool. Liberals were talking to the youth and to the new generation in more convincing terms than them. So neoconservatives understood that they needed to win the battle of ideas. And in fact, they would not win because of their ability to manage the market economy, because liberals were doing a better job than them. Okay, we all have to keep in mind that Clinton did a better job than Reagan, that Tony Blair did a better job than Margaret Thatcher, then Gerhard Schröder did a better job than Helmut Kohl, okay, and you can go on and on. In every single country, one after the other, social democratic governments, which is what they were supposed to be, okay, were more rigorous and strict, okay, defenders of financial markets, okay, and capitalist forces than their conservative adversaries. So conservative forces could only win on the field of ideas, moral issues, what today is called societal issues, death penalty, abortion, gay marriage, you name them, diversions. Okay. So they played a key role here. And of course, if we want to understand, for example, why ultra-conservative forces are so powerful on social media today, okay, and they have been for the last 20 years, we need to know that they have a media agenda. They have had a media agenda for 40, 50 years, because according to them, the key battle site is ideological. Okay, is really, it's talk shows more than elections. Okay, you win elections through talk shows. Today you say through social media. Of course, in that same process, those far right or strong right-wing movements have managed to present themselves in more decent ways. Okay, it's the decent clothes that the raw, naked right-wing has learned to put on, to look acceptable. They've managed to clean their image. They've managed to soften their voice and their language. Okay, they managed to rewrite their history, even if their history has to do with white supremacy in the US or collaboration with the Nazis in France. So you just erase that part. And they managed to impose these issues of race, culture, religion, civilization in the public space, to the point that today these issues are the ones debated everywhere, whether or not they're invited to discuss them. And in this point on the ideological assault, okay, and strategy and offensive of the right and the far right, there are many aspects, of course, that could be covered. I'm thinking of one that's really interesting that I took from this book by Christina Stokol and Dmitry Uzaner called The Moralist International, subtitled Russia in Global Culture Wars. Basically, what's revealed here, I mean, I was not aware of it, is that think tanks, neoconservative, groups from the US decided to launch a sort of war of influence in Russia as soon as the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1991 under Boris Yeltsin. Okay. With such things as, a new alliance between evangelists in the US and Orthodox Christians in Russia, with congresses on family values, okay, and worshiping, family as the last sacred group. And in fact, we end up in Putin's Russia, okay, with the same language, the same priorities in terms of traditional values than in Trump's America. Okay, it's so interesting to see that this parallel is the result of an actual strategy, ideological strategy. No wonder why these two countries sometimes, depending on who leads them, resemble each other. Okay, now, the other point, which is the responsibility of liberals in this state of affairs. And that's, for me, the number one reason why we are here today. Progressist forces, again, you can call them social democrats in Europe, you can call them, Democrats in the US. You can call them even socialists, okay, in some Latin American countries. When in power, once reaching power, were faced with an impossible situation, okay, in which if the country was to still attract investments, okay, if neighbors, partners, or for Europe, the European Union were not to punish them for what they were doing, they had to soften their political program. They have to, in fact, give up the social generosity they had announced. They had to go back to budget orthodoxy, okay, and rigor, which they all did. And they did in much better terms than their right-wing counterparts, okay? In other words, they gave up on those working classes who had voted for them and who historically were their constituents, their natural electoral base. Okay, and of course, these working classes, probably this category is too broad, okay, but being abandoned politically and ideologically, a good number of them crossed the political street or avenue and went vote for the far right. Okay, so there's that aspect. There is also the fact that liberal forces, left-wing progressist forces, went through an internal crisis, division. This division we're still in today. It was a rising, okay, tension dating back to the 1980s, probably, between what sometimes is called the social left and the cultural left. In other words, progressist forces from the old labor union, anti-capitalist, okay, and at least collective, okay, policies of, you know, the 1960s, and identity politics, to make a long story short, or at least all these minority movements defending gender, racial, post-colonial justice and equality. These two sides, these two families, which should work hand in hand, which should not be separated, okay, contributed to the ideological division of the progressist camp. It's so interesting. I mean, in countries like France, the most vocal opponents to what is sometimes called wokeism or wokeness are to be found, you know, among liberals. Okay, in the same way that in the US, some liberals, okay, denounced what they called the twilight of common dreams. In other words, if we no longer have common dreams, all of us, it's because of those gay and lesbian movements, of those anti-racist movements, of all these scattered movements, selfish movements in the way they describe them. Okay, so this internal division of the progressist camp is one key reason for the decline of their power. And it works both ways. In other words, in the same way that the social left, which is usually more like the boomers generation, should definitely open themselves to what the new generation is sensitive to, okay, because politicization for the youth starts with identity, starts with discrimination, starts with, you know, gender and racial disparities, right? Well, in that same way, the cultural left, those people, you know, the woke or the minority groups, should also be very careful to not throw the baby with the bathwater, to not forget the fight against capitalism and market forces as a key battle site for their very agenda, okay? Because if they don't, well, then they will become market segments, okay, of new marketing strategies where you can sell stuff to whoever, you know, to people of color, to gay and lesbian people. They just become marketing segments, okay? So if they want their struggle to remain a radical struggle, they also need to join forces with the old social left. In other words, division, internal division of the left. So to end on this point, liberals have done nothing against the advent of neoliberalism. And I would say of even authoritarian neoliberalism, because the kind of regime we live in most countries on earth these days is not exactly neoliberalism. It's neoliberalism with surveillance, control, police forces, and very often states of legal exception, whether it's a COVID lockdown, a terrorist threat, Olympic Games, you name it, okay, in which, well, you know what, we're gonna arrest you even if the rest of the time we should not be doing it, okay? So a state of legal exception combined with a belief in market forces and principles, that's authoritarian neoliberalism. That's what the kind of dominant regime we live in. Well, what used to be called the left has done nothing to oppose it, to counter it. And basically they've been punished in elections, one after the other. Now let me reach the point on the desirability of this hyper or ultra conservative political forces, the far right. I still don't know how to exactly qualify them. This to me is really the most important point. We all agree that the sad, the tragic images of January 6, 2021 in Washington, DC, the assault on Capitol Hill, were very striking images, very, very striking. What was striking about these images was that, I'll put it that way, a revolutionary desire exists in world politics today. It exists, it is visible, it was unfolded that day. It just so happened that it's on the far right, no longer on the far left. Okay. Because what we saw was a largely spontaneous movement, of course, ignited by the words of till then President Trump, okay, but whether or not he had spoken, obviously his supporters, okay, were ready to do what they did, okay, so largely spontaneous. And with all these little videos on social media, you could see a form of joy, a very scary form of joy, right? I mean, they were, enjoying it, okay? They were actually invading, the sacred building of US democracy with pride, with joy. And to me, this is the major point. What they are doing, whether it's, the discourse of white supremacy, racist attacks, regressive laws, conservative candidates in elections, what they are doing with great joy, okay, and contagious pride. It's as if their side of politics, which had been judged obsolete after World War II, right, which has been secondary during these 3 decades, okay, of social progress worldwide, okay, after World War II, and which still was a little tacky and outdated at the end of the 20th century, right, suddenly became, the emblem of the freedom of thought, speech, action, lifestyle, okay. There are influencers on social media, okay, who are young, are fun, might even be, explicitly gay or people of color. I'm thinking even of French examples, and yet side on this far right camp or defend values, ideas, or just simply bills, okay, to be submitted to Congress that are on the far right, okay. And this is really important because, 60 years ago, what was attractive for the youth to the progressive side of politics was this very spirit of joy, of taking power, of overthrowing the status quo, okay. Well, this impression of overthrowing the status quo is exactly what the far right is spreading, is selling to their voters and constituents, and that's what's working. And that's what's probably the most difficult to counter, to oppose, okay? Because you can win, ballots, you can win in Congress. This battle of the zeitgeist, okay, of what's desirable, of what's fun, of what's bold, okay, and independent-minded, is much less easy to win. By the way, I'm not centering everything on the US. Okay, this image of January 6, 2021, as you know, was replicated a year later in Brasilia. Okay, when supporters of Bolsonaro did the same, invaded public buildings in Brasilia, and has equivalents in many social movements or actions, actual political actions by far-right parties in Europe, where you realize, just looking at their faces and how they look and how they act, that they're not those old, tacky, scary guys from the 20th century. They're young, they look cool, and they might actually convince many more people to follow them. What's interesting here is that this general spirit of the far right has managed to dissimulate their inner divisions, because here we're not dealing with a monolith, obviously. We're dealing with a series of small groups, small political parties who have actually very often different agendas, competing agendas. In France, for example, we had in the last presidential election, we had two far-right parties. Okay, so we were all very happy that there were two, because it would mean that less forces for one of the two. But they managed to dissimulate their divisions through this strategy. And they are divided over more or less everything. Okay, what to do with the state, public authorities. Okay, usually the far right, except the totalitarian far right of a Nazi regime, okay, is not ready to nationalize, collectivize, and give the keys of the social order to the state. They are divided also over Russia. It's so interesting that so many of these far-right groups in whatever country, from the US to Western Europe to, are either allied with Putin's Russia, or at least attracted by the type of political authority that he embodies. Then you have the rise of the global South, which to the far right is a problem, obviously, because it seems like their supremacy, their Western or white supremacy, however you can call it, seems to be reaching a historical term end, right? Well, they have a very different approach to this. Okay, some of them are ready to welcome people of color because they understood that to make their political force stronger, they need to welcome them. Others are much more direct, okay, much more supremacist, and actually do not. So what I'm saying here is that there's no monolithic far right. What there is a series of ideological and political propositions, fantasies, okay? You might even say nightmarish ideas, okay? That are scattered enough, okay, to divide voters. But what they manage to do is to attract all of it to them. They have their heroes. Okay, in the very same way that the leftists or the far left activists of the 1960s and 70s had their heroes. Okay, heroes, guerrilla heroes, which could be, Che Guevara, or could be the more arguable actions of Red Army fraction terrorists in Germany. Okay, Ulrike Meinhof, okay, Bader, and everything. Well, you have the exact equivalents of these today. I mean, of course, I would not compare them, but they are the heroes of this ultra-conservative political camp, whether it's Peyton Gendron, okay, his rampage killing in Buffalo, Brendan Tarrant, okay, in New Zealand, we'll remember the attack on the mosque, Anders Breivik, the Norwegian far-right supremacist who managed to kill 80 young liberals who had come for some political meeting, or older figures such as Timothy McVeigh in the US with the attack on the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1993, and so on and so forth. They're iconic figures on this side of politics. And also what they managed to do, which I think is so interesting in the era of social media, is to turn their flaws, their political and personal flaws, into qualities attracting them more attention and more voters. their political incompetence or ignorance, okay, is presented as a real form of intellectual independence. They rely on no previous principle, of course. They are aware of nothing. Their emotional attitude, the way they would suddenly crack down or insult someone, is seen as a form of honesty. They're sincere. They're not like these, overly rational liberal politicians who will, speak in way too general terms. Fake news. Why are they using fake news? Well, they might get it wrong. They might be using flawed arguments, but it proves that they are looking for alternative sources of knowledge, that they are brave and bold enough to not believe in the existing sources of knowledge, which are what, by the way? Education, general education, maybe mainstream news media, all these things that conspiracy theories tell us are flawed, wrong, lying to us. Okay, so you see, it's this transfer of each flaw, each absurd feature, okay, of these people into a reason to follow them, believe in them, and vote for them. I also maybe another word on. I quickly said that there is a broad diversity of subfamilies in this far right camp. The most rapidly rising subfamily or subcurrent today is the libertarian one. And that's really interesting. And not only, in fact, in North America or even in Brazil, but in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. It's what we call in Europe anarcho-capitalism. The idea that capitalism is the best way to remove all sources of authority, okay, to have no master, to have no boss, to have no manager. Have you ever seen a corporation with no managers, by the way? And that in this way of investing, okay, creating value, economic value, would be some form of emancipation from existing authorities. This argument, okay, which you can find in the philosophy of Murray Rothbard, okay, which you can find in any tweet by Elon Musk, because that's his, profoundly his ideology, his cup of tea, is probably the most popular branch, okay, of this multifaceted far right or strong right wing of today. Okay, let's try and recapitulate these bad news. It's interesting because, yeah, just one word on this notion of anarchism and capitalism. Somehow, for some weird reason, one sign that things were going to go really bad, I remember finding in the 1990s in one silly little example, really an anecdote. Microsoft founder Bill Gates had an appointment with President Clinton in the White House. And I remember that because back then I was a journalist, I was supposed to write a piece, and I know that he had some sort of appointment back in Seattle, where Microsoft is based, after that. Clinton was late. After waiting 20 minutes, Bill Gates decided to board his private plane and go back to Seattle. In other words, he waited for the US president 20 minutes, but could not wait more. Okay. An interesting anecdotal. However, what's really interesting here is that the type of not only economic, but also cultural and ideological power that these future big tech, web giants, because Microsoft was just a computer company back then, were holding, made them so powerful in terms of sheer quantity, money, but also in terms of influence, soft power, if you want, that they recognize no authority, above them, and that waiting for the US president can be done for 15 minutes, but no more. Okay. And I see in this silly example the idea that the old system of hierarchies and authorities and vertical power is being put in question, if not entirely overthrown, by capitalism, late capitalism, the most recent brand of capitalism, in which, yes, indeed, the last thing Elon Musk would want to do would be to be elected US president, even if he's born in South Africa and will not be allowed to do so. But he would have much less power than he and his pals do have today, right? So I see here, the origin of this notion that vertical power, to manage the world, is to be found in those giant corporations more than in traditional politics. Okay, so a point of conclusion. Where are we doing today? Where are we? I'll start with a list. I started my presentation with a list. I must end it with another list, a sad one. I'm speaking of the right or the far right. We might discuss how to qualify it, but I must evidence the fact that they are in power or about to come back to power. Yes, Donald Trump might be back in the White House in 6 months. Likewise, Jair Bolsonaro might be re-elected in 3 years if the Brazilian Supreme Court, does not prevent him from doing so. Javier Milei is dismantling welfare and public state in Argentina. Military coups are happening on a weekly or monthly basis in sub-Saharan Africa. A very sad mix of radical Islam and militarized dictatorship is what's in place in most Muslim and Middle Eastern countries. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, name it. Hindu nationalism is more powerful than ever, after the several terms of Narendra Modi and his BJP party in India. China is more powerful than ever. It's not exactly neither a communist nor a democratic country. Ultra-conservative leaders are back in Indonesia and the Philippines. And I find, as a sign of the times, the fact that in the Philippines, it's the very son of former dictator Marcos, who's the president of the country. As for Russia, same. Let's not be mistaken by words, Yes, Putin has as his mission, his official mission, to denazify Ukraine and the rest of the world, But at every single level of the kind of power structure he has put together in Russia, this is a far-right government, What he says about Russian culture, Russian, the Russian nation and the Russian soul, what he says about Islam, the way he favors financial markets, oligarchs, and giant corporations, the way he places religion and family values at the core of everything, the way he represses gay and lesbian, and so on and so forth. So yes, he might be nostalgic of the USSR, but there's no question about it. What about Europe? Well, the far right is in power officially, post-elections in Italy, Hungary, Poland, and is the first political force. It is the #1 political force in terms of, votes in regular elections in such countries as France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and so on. And as for the countries where radical extremist far-right parties seemed like clowns, they are no longer clowns and they actually gain more and more votes. I'm of course speaking about Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, UKIP in Great Britain, Vox in Spain, and so on and so forth. What am I saying here? That these people might be reaching positions of power or staying in power, and that their presence not only on the political scene, not only in the hearts and minds of those voting for them, but in our media agenda, in the kind of topics discussed in talk shows or social media, make us utterly unable to confront the two major issues of our time, which I believe are three conflicts, three things that make us, all of us, at war, because we are at war. Well, at war for democracy, because yes, indeed, democracy is losing ground worldwide, okay? Whether it's still formally democratic regimes that no longer are democratic regimes, or simply dictators taking power in one country after another. The second battleground for me is the struggle for justice and equality for minority groups, whether it be gender, racial, migrants. Okay, we all know that the number of migrants is going to be multiplied, okay, by maybe a 10 factor, maybe a 100 factor in the coming decades. Okay, so if we have racist regimes, okay, who treat them as second row citizens, how will they do? And here again, these issues of wokeism, okay, and it used to be called political correctness 30 years ago, but it's the same battle. In fact, it's the far right or conservative forces creating a moral panic over some sort of radical project to turn all our kids into transgender kids, right? Or to invade our countries, with people of color. Okay, this insane fascist propaganda, which does work. Okay, it does work. So in this struggle, also we must take sides. And the third one is the most important one, and that's maybe the only long-term battle, because the rest might be solved by then. And that's the vital combat to reduce and contain climate change, the environmental apocalypse looming on the horizon. Okay, there are threats on life on Earth in general. Okay, and what I'm saying here is that this general spirit of scapegoating, of conspiracy theories, of going back to essentialized values such as the nation, the family, okay, the father, and all of these, makes us utterly unable to fight climate change, to fight the environmental crisis, to set up a new alliance among living organisms, because that's, I think, where we are today. We need a solidarity among life forms. Okay, the humans cannot be considered, separately anymore. So three struggles. Okay, minority rights, maintaining or rescuing democracy, and containing climate change, for which the presence of the right wing in our minds, in our social media, and very often in our sites of power makes us unable to confront. Okay, so I suppose I will end here. Maybe I will just one familiar quote. This fateful rise of this political force that I'm describing here was, and to a certain extent still is, resistible. And here I want to quote the great title of Bertolt Brecht's 1930s play on the resistible ascent of, it was Arthur we, but he had made up this, dictator clown, okay, in the exact same way that Charles Chaplin did the same with his movie, okay, but to teach us a lesson. This clown, when he was a clown, his ascent, his rise to power was indeed resistible. In fact, you could even say easily resistible. So once it is too late, it is no longer resistible, okay, we need to understand what happened. Okay, so I insist on this resistible qualifier because I believe this situation we will be discussing now, to a certain extent, could be avoided and is resistible. Okay, so I suppose I'll end here.
Well, thank you very much for this going to be complex breakdown of a number of issues that you've identified that is what is going on with us in this world. And I still have a feeling of more, which is where do we really go now? You know, I mean, where do we go now? We saw in the sense that it's very complex. How do you get involved? And so I was wondering if you've been thinking through this, and then we can start discussing these things, how people here are reacting and have reacted to what you've been saying, and let's get the dialogue going. So where do we go?
Where do we go from now?
I know.
If only I knew, I wouldn't be here speaking to you.
Well, we don't want that. We want to speak to you too.
Nostradamus might have the answer. No, I mean, really, to make a long story short, the important point here is what I've tried to present as the quasi-mechanical backlash. What has happened during these decades of progress, social, cultural, ideological, political progress, is that people in power, mostly in economic positions of power, managers, CEOs, owners of corporations, found that the world had become ungovernable. And ungovernable, they meant, a number of strikes. And even in the US, they were, dozens of days of strike every year. That's unacceptable, right? Demonstration, marches, ways of addressing each other. They found that it was chaos. And they started fashioning strategies, concepts, tools, even technologies of surveillance, okay, in order to make this situation impossible again, like in order to make corporations, citizens, societies governable again. And so the list of things that how do you make things governable? Well, entertainment, quite important, okay? Social control, right? Political debate, the kind of issues that are imposed, the law. Okay, that's probably the more direct way. So you see what I'm saying here is for a few years, a few short years, it's as if the world had become ungovernable. Back in the days, 50, 60 years ago. It didn't last much, right? And those who went through it and who got scared to lose their grip and their power have promised to do everything to make that impossible. That's what they have been doing over the last 50 years. That's basically the point I'm defending here. But that doesn't tell us where to go from now.
Please. Sure. That would be great.
Thank you for your presentation about how we got here, but you ended it with saying that we have to resist. We can resist still, right? But like what exactly will the center or the leftist center have to do? Will it have to adopt, for example, some of the techniques of the right, which have led us to this place? I mean, I'm thinking, look, like history is filled with examples, so many sad examples of sort of, the good people being, for example, just assassinated, like Yitzhak Rabin or the Kennedys or Benazir Bhutto, the politicians in South America who were somehow disposed of, or the Iranian president in the 1950s, for example, who was democratically elected and also deposed. And I don't know. I mean, what actually can be done other than, are we going to be forced to adopt these sort of horrific kind of techniques, or is there a peaceful way of actually changing, what we've gotten to?
Thank you. I mean, that's probably the most important question. It's interesting because your short list, incomplete list of great political figures assassinated, who were on the left, sometimes on the moderate left, very often were assassinated either directly or indirectly by US decision. Think of Salvador Allende, think of the Condor operation. So what I'm saying here is that makes the situation more complex than just, good and evil, good versus evil. Now, the pessimistic answer is, for liberal forces, for progressist forces, we are, I believe, entering some sort of dark age, meaning that they will remain a minority group, majority in some sections, some subsections of the social order, but overall minority, losing elections and having a hard time even maintaining the conquest of the last 50 years for a few years, if not a few decades to come. Because what has happened, which is liberal governments in power who have given up on their historical defense of working class people, this will leave a trace in collective memory and in voting reflexes, for a long time. So even if the lies and the mystifications of the far right are revealed, and we all know at some point that yes, the earth is not flat, no, the Israeli government is not controlling the world economy, and and so on and so forth, and no, the Democratic Party is not a network of criminal pedophiles. Even if this is proven and we go back to reason, this battle of ideas has been won for a long time, on at least short to midterm. This battle is lost. So the only way for liberal forces to go back to power would be to be brave enough to offer some sort of alternative to the existing economic system. I'm not talking of a radical communist alternative. I'm thinking of a return to regulation, a return to a New Deal, a return to a Rooseveltian approach, which is unthinkable in today's United States. So it's the only way, and that takes decades. So that will not change overnight, unfortunately, I'm afraid. It's interesting because if you think of the youth, many young people are on this progressist or left-wing side of politics. So how do they do? Very often what they do is they choose to leave the boat, to depart, to go start a community on their own, to do a self-management of their city neighborhood, to make a life choice, different from a career, or so they don't take power, they don't offer an alternative system, they choose to secede. And it's a sign of the times. It means that the only alternative is a small-scale, community alternative. There's no global alternative, in other words. So that's what I call a dark age, meaning, we won't see a full-scale alternative program ready to win elections before a certain time, I'm afraid. Before a long time, I'm afraid. I mean, if some of you know of such a platform or a program in any given country, I'd be happy to. I mean, look, I can even give you the example of, it's a great example, Greece. Greece had this, the far left, the Syriza party, Trotskyist party, won the elections more than 10 years ago. It was an amazing news in Europe because, Europe, is a neoliberal system, with a very powerful central bank who's imposing a sort of, Reaganian and Thatcherian, and suddenly those, leftists were elected. but their life and their political action was made impossible as soon as they arrived in power. So impossible that they had to betray one promise after another. They had to become the sort of the arm of the very institutions they oppose, which is the European Central Bank, the IMF, and everything. They're still in power today, which sounds very weird. Well, no wonder. You know, they are no longer a threat to the existing social and economic order, and even to the EU, so they can remain in power. See what I mean? So that's, you know, what at the best, that's what happens to a left-wing government. Yes. Please.
Hi, my name is my name is Matisse. I'm a third year student, sorry, here at the University of Toronto, and I'm currently doing some research into the AfD and their power base, especially in Eastern Germany. We're seeing lots of pro-democracy protests now. I've talked to lots of people who've been organizing these, and they've said that they've been mischaracterized as being, you know, the target is not to convince people not to vote for the far right, but to do exactly what you said, to resist and show that resistance, especially in the villages where the majority, the hegemonic majority, is far right to fascist, and show the people who are in the minority there who believe in democracy that democracy is still possible. However, what can we do if the capital is on the side of this far right? I mean, we had this meeting in Potsdam where that got leaked, wherein business owners as well as neo-Nazis as well as the AfD met together to talk about sending people, even with German passports who weren't German, to Africa, to camps in North Africa, which is very reminiscent of the 30s in Germany. So how can we still somehow resist if all the capital is on the other side?
Well, very interesting. First of all, the first thing we can do is do what you do, which is to do research on this and to try and understand better the political lessons to be drawn from the rise and the normalization, the quasi-normalization of such, you know, extremist political forces as AfD is. My belief, and it's not a belief, it's something that's evidenced by polls, you know, pollsters and sociological studies, is that the majority of voters for such parties, it can be AfD, again, Vox in Spain, it can be the Rassemblement National in France, are not supremacists or even racist people. What they are, the majority of them, is people whose social condition has gone down so much, okay, in terms of simply, you know, joining both ends together and you know and taxes and joblessness and, you know, and social segregation in bad neighborhoods and everything, that they felt abandoned by progressive forces and decided to try, you know, in Europe they say try, you know, as if, you know, you try Hitler. Okay, the problem is you can't try, because sometimes it happens that this thing stays, right? But it's very important to remind us this. You can't essentialize voters or political opinion on this side of politics, because what they are doing is trying to send a message to oppose parties, traditional political parties that they felt had betrayed them, to try and see if something else works better, much more than to vote for, you know, crazy genocidal supremacists, okay, which of course very, very, very few people do support. So that's the kind of thing that made AfD decent, presentable in today's Germany. Interestingly, in former East Germany, because obviously in former East Germany, the economic disparity is such that they're the ones who felt, you know, abandoned by progressive forces and went for the far right vote. Add to this the fact, I mean, it's a complex issue, but the Cold War, the Soviet camp, was a way of freezing the situation in many societies. So when you took out this sort of bubble of the Cold War and the Soviet camp on all these countries, what happened is they went back to these tensions, hostilities, and hatred that they had before the Cold War, before the Soviet rule, which happened to be prohibited during that time, which can be whatever, anti-Semitism, racism, wariness vis-a-vis migrants or whatever, and suddenly it comes back. It comes back, and yes, it feels like you live in a racist place, but no, it's also a mechanical reaction to what happened before. So I can only encourage you to keep working on AFD. It's very important to see what sort of party it is and how it becomes a very presentable, in fact, a party that the regular conservative parties of Germany are now ready to ally with, okay, which they were not a few years ago, okay? So in the very same way that, in France, center-left or center-right parties, such as the one in power of Macron, are basically voicing out the issues and the preoccupation of the far right, so much so that they are imposing these issues in the public space, okay? So that's the way they win. They don't win by, by ambushing migrants and killing gay and lesbian people. They win by winning this battle of ideas, talk shows, and by sometimes remaining silent and letting more mainstream people voice out their very issues. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Yes. Do you want to come up to the...
Hello, Professor. Thank
Hello.
you so much for coming. I learned so much from this lecture, and I really appreciate the time that you've given us. My name is Victoria, and I am a political science student in the States, University of Georgia in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have two questions for you. I have a million questions I want to ask, but I'm just going to limit it to two. So first and foremost, I see that what is happening right now a lot with my generation is people who want to be journalists, people who want to do that kind of more traditional side of news reporting, those jobs are becoming obsolete. More and more we see small news stations being closed down, and the big news corporations like the New York Times or the Washington Post are being now dominated by capitalists, people like Fox News and Rupert Murdoch and all that stuff. So that being said, for somebody who doesn't know exactly what I want to do within political science, but I have this ambition for wanting to do something like what journalism used to do back in the old days, what would you recommend for a student like myself? And my second question is, I know this is US centered, this question I have, but I do want to know what your opinion is on the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, because it's really scary listening to some of the things that they have to say. So, yes.
Okay. It's great that people your age want to be journalists. It's great, and it's slightly ironic because it's not that the job is obsolete at all. It's more necessary than ever. Okay, when I teach my classes in University of Paris, I basically teach about muckrakers. Okay, muckrakers. It's great tradition of independent investigative journalists in the US, and who, the most famous example being the Watergate, but who basically were really a counterpower, right? And I'm telling them, you will be muckrakers because you seem to, that's what you want to do. That's the kind of mission or role you want to have in our crazy world, right? Problem is, you won't be hired nowhere. There's no, the economic model of investigative journalism is in crisis, if not entirely over. Okay, why? Because of the free press. Most of the news that we read is free. Okay, we can just read, 25% of the New York Times. That is the non-paying part. Okay, and just the beginning of an article. Who wants to read the whole thing, right? And of course, much more seriously, the competition between mainstream news media and social media, alt media. I mean, the media of you and me. Anybody saying anything and having more views than a given. So basically, your generation must do these two things, which is a lot, which is to re-enchant this old mission of muckrakers, that is to play a role as counterpowers, okay, in this crazy world, and most importantly, to reinvent an economic model so that you can live off this great mission of yours, okay, because obviously we are real life people. We need to eat and survive. More seriously, there are a few examples of what's called pure players, pure players being strictly online media that were born online as online media, that offer a paying service, which goes against the grain of today's news because everything is free, but precisely they impose payment, a subscription fee. And sometimes it works because the kind of job they are doing, investigative journalism, you don't find among free papers or, and all these things. So it can work. In France, we have this great example of this investigative media called Mediapart, okay, which is now the most influential investigative media in France because they literally take down, cabinet members, ministers, elected officials because they reveal, cases of corruption or whatever. And they have the largest journalistic force in France, 160 investigative journalists. And their economic model is very simple, €11 a month, €11 a month, okay. So what I'm saying here is, you guys must go in this direction, but you must also remember that you need to invent some sort of economic model so that it's viable, okay, viable. And as for the Heritage Foundation's, project for America 2025, well, I would inscribe it in the larger picture of all these conservative think tanks, which is almost like a redundant term because not that many progressist think tanks these days, who have basically softened their language also to endorse what I'm describing here, what is happening to US and even to world politics, okay? The emergence of these new populist far-right leaders, these movements of opinion towards, repressing this or that liberty. And so basically, these guys are realists. So they say, okay, if really we have a profound subterranean movement of public opinion in this direction, let's endorse it. Let's make it the platform of the future, and let's invent, a portrait of future US or America that will look like it. It's sheer ideological opportunism, and it's very dangerous indeed. But again, if you can present me a counterexample, of some sort of, a think tank started by Bernie Sanders, I don't think such a thing exists, unfortunately. That's what's too bad.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Hi, I'm not going to walk out with it.
Okay.
My name's about that way.
I can hear you.
Thank you so much. You just scared the cheapers out.
You're very welcome.
Okay, but I'm grateful for the talk. Just a very simple question. When you started off, you mentioned about 4 or 6 factors why things have moved or going towards the far right. And one of them was AI. I just wondered if you could expand on that factor a little bit more as to how AI is going to play out, is playing out in the grand scheme of things, either from a political standpoint and also from an economic standpoint. I know, R2D2 is going to replace most of us at some point in time, but I just want to see how that's going to play out. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, very important point. No, basically what I didn't exactly say that AI is on the side of what I'm describing. I said that, like a joke, but maybe it's not a joke, that it seems like AI is currently taking over where humans have failed. And yes, humans have failed in, for example, politics and ideologies. If humans, with the type of challenges that they have to face today, and I'm saying humans because it's really a global phenomenon, such as the environmental crisis, a maddened form of capitalism, which is not under control and everything. If in this situation, they elect the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, and the Marcos, then yes, let's let AI take over. It'll do a better job. So that it's kind of it's a silly joke, but it means we have failed so much that we deserve, AI taking over. Now, more seriously, it's a complex question because I really don't think that big tech or new technologies or cyberspace or however you call it, meta, is on any given political or ideological side. I think technologies are pretty much neutral. It all depends on what users you have of them. And the users of these technologies today, at least in the post-2000 era, okay, because the very first decade of the internet was still undecided. It was more progressist, in fact. You had pretty much, crazy left-wing ideas, but no one was connected. Back then, it was 15% people who were nerds, basically. But then you have the post-2000 era, what's called Web 2.0, which is the rise of the web giants, the creation of Google, of Facebook, social media and everything. And it's basically the takeover of this giant new space by corporations defending their interest directly and defending an ideological and economic agenda, aligning at least with the market economy, with a mix of liberal ideas and the market economy. And so the uses of these technologies go in this direction, but we could do different things with it. Those people in Muslim countries who rose up in 2011, remember, it was called the Arab Springs, okay? They managed to overthrow their dictators and governments. How did they do that? Via Facebook. Without Facebook, they could not have done it because it was not, legal to even meet in the street. So what I'm saying is, it's what you do with the technology much more than the tech itself. Now, AI poses such giant challenges and threats that it's really hard to answer the question. What is sure that we will need to redefine labor as something of a lesser role and importance in human life than before, because indeed, midterm or long-term estimate is that at least half of existing professions will quickly vanish, disappear, meaning be more efficiently replaced by some sort of AI system. Okay, so what do we do with it? Are we doing something with our newly free time, that's different from what we used to do? Are we reinventing, activities, professional or non-professional, for example, for the community, okay, for, the neighborhood that we had stopped doing for centuries, in fact, because now we have sort of, abstract lives. We don't really, who does the shopping for the elderly in their building? Not enough among us, I'm afraid, right? So you see what I mean? So here is a very important political question, which is what will we do with the kind of social and labor transformation entailed by AI? Okay. Then there's the issue of agency. Okay, if AI takes over, at many levels, what about collective and individual agency? Okay, what about freedom? It's more like a philosophical question. And here again, the answer is very different whether you're a Trumpist or a progressist, obviously, okay, you will give a different answer. So it's really hard to say. What is sure is that AI currently is in the hands of private corporations and research centers who have a very clear ideological agenda, okay, which is the Silicon Valley's agenda, right? Which might be doing a bit of greenwashing and woke politics to dissimulate that agenda, but that agenda is no state regulation, trust in the financial economy, and a form of self-sufficiency of those giant corporations that no one will ever control or contain. Okay, so it's not going in the right direction. But again, it's a technology, so it depends what we collectively, humans, want to do with it. Okay, that's a political decision. So it's too vague an answer, but your question was gigantic.
Yes.
Hello, thanks for your presentation. I'm Milad, Master of Global Affairs student here at Monk School. My question is also related to the last question about the rise of social media. Far right has gained a lot of power since, in recent 15 years. And also in the last 15 years, we also see the rise of social media. And there is a positive correlation here. To what extent do you think this is only a simple positive correlation that could help far-right movement to increase the speed of its popularity? and to increase its reach? And to what extent do you think there is a causal relationship here, a conditional factor that without social media, far-right movement could not, had the power that right now it has?
Mm-hmm. That's thank you very much. It's an extremely important point. The correlation is indirect. I mean, and we all know it. What happened is that the rise of social media and the larger rise of cyberspace and the meta universe in general has resulted in the loss of credibility, legitimacy of mainstream sources of truth, knowledge, opinion, whether it's general education, institutions of education, recognize, acknowledge, general knowledge, from encyclopedia, from mainstream news media, which played that role back in the days. I mean, people would read, the same newspaper. There were left-wing or right-wing newspapers, but were more or less covering the same issues. All of these things have been put aside, have seen their readership, viewership decline, and have been replaced by, how can we say, BS media, right? By inventions and mystification that people have started to believe in, their minds, their cognitive abilities being available to such BS. And this is where the far right influence or strategy gets in, because they need to use it. Basically, this is the only point where I'll be optimistic. For the far right to be in power, you need to lie to people. There's no other way to do it. If you don't lie to people, then they will be reasonable enough, sensible enough to not vote for these crazy propositions. So you need to lie to them. So in a world where the stable foundations of truth and a shared common knowledge have disappeared or are in danger, yes, there is leeway for them to sneak in, to get in. So they have been using it. Another thing, which is very important here, is that social media have played a major role in making mobilizations more individual and less collective. Meaning, you basically spread a word on social media. I mean, my daughters do it, my students do it. About to defend this or that cause, and it's great. It's great. People are mobilized, but it's an individual mobilization. It's basically you try to, increase the number of individuals mobilized. You don't go through organizations, existing organizations. You don't go through unions. You don't go through the political parties. No longer exist. And this type of mobilization, strictly individual, not collective, at the end of the day, favors the right and the far right. The main obstacle to their ascent, to their rise to power, is collective organizations. This is where people can be educated to understand that their interest is to not vote for these people, that that these are the socio-economic conditions they live in. You basically need to instruct them, and this, it's not happening. It's basically not happening. So I'm not saying that the entire social media sphere is monopolized by the far right, but they have used it to their benefit much more efficiently than liberals. That is for sure. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps we have time for one more discussion point.
Please feel free to rephrase my question if it's not appropriate. But do you think the movement for animal rights or animal welfare, especially farm animals, is politically significant?
I don't need to rephrase it. It's a very clearly phrased question. It's a very important thing. I mean, mobilizations for non-human life forms, whether it's animal rights, but it can also be, you have also movements to recognize as legal subjects a river, a forest, a portion of the sky. Okay. Some people did it. It happened in Colorado. It happened in New Zealand. It happened in India. Legal decisions that basically give rights to a natural element in the exact same way that animals have been recognized as sensitive, therefore subject to emotions, pain, okay, suffering, and needing to be better treated. So what I'm saying is all these movements and mobilizations are key today, because we are all on the same boat, okay? In fact, you could say that in the exact same way that some people are in a situation of burnout, stress at work, animals or even natural elements are also in similar situations of stress or over exploitation, okay? When you overuse, water, air, natural resources, I mean, why are they exhausted if not because we have overused them? So as for animals, I suppose we are no longer in the pre-industrial era of animals being used for labor, okay? But today we have, what is the number? 50 billion animals massacred every year for human food. Okay, so what I'm saying is, yes, these mobilizations are, very important ones in the future. But what I'm saying is, we need to go further than just one specific cause after another. We need to understand this sort of solidarity, unprecedented solidarity among life forms. And what I'm saying here is that we humans are the ones responsible for animal suffering and for the, disappearing of species. So when I'm saying solidarity, it means let's stop being above, other life forms. So yes, indeed, there's this great philosopher, Donna Haraway, professor of history at University of California, who defends this idea of a companionship between all species. Really companions. She starts with her dog. She says, my dog is my companion, but not in the silly meaning of, I'm alone and, it helps me. No, in the sense of a reciprocal, a mutual way of learning from each other, of changing the world for the benefit of both, of a companionship, a strong solidarity. And I really believe in this notion, companionship, solidarity.
Well, I think we should come to a close. You've been very generous of your time and your thought and your energy and your beliefs and how you articulated this. And so I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you very much.